You're giving them a pathway to succeed at their job description and to start making it a more normal part of the department for them to be able to supervise and to not feel weird to the technicians. Those types of things that we can do to help our frontline leaders in probably their first ever job in leading employees can be really powerful and shaping so that whenever it comes time to replace that manager, you've got somebody who has some practiced skills under their belt and has earned that trust. So
rising above the buzz of ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week, we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal: to help you fight dirty, every instrument, every time. Whether you're tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go beyond clean.
What's up, clean freaks? I'm Bobby Parker, and I've got joining me today Hank Balch to talk about our favorite roles in the sterile processing department, perhaps that frontline leader, our lead techs, our supervisors. Oh, Captain, my Captain. Hank, I'm excited to dive into this one. Thanks for joining us for this conversation.
Yeah, Bobby, I've got a special place in my heart for supervisors because they're the first ones that gave me a job. You know, they hired me, they interviewed me, and they said, yeah, we're going to bet on this random guy who's never done sterile processing in his life. So yeah, shout out to all those supervisors and lead techs. And this episode is not only for you, but it's especially for you and anybody else who've ever had a great experience, a bad experience, or maybe one day you want to become a supervisor or lead tech. Buckle up, because we've got an episode for you today.
Yeah, as always, we're going to try to make this relevant to all of our listeners, whether or not you're a supervisor. And even if you're just a vendor listening in or you have no aspirations of being a supervisor, hey, we're getting this CE approved. So buckle up. It's going to be a good one. We'll be right back. I'm Bobby Parker.
And I'm Hank Balch.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
And joining us in studio now to talk about lead techs and supervisors on this season, about the roles that make us great, is Hank Balch. Hank, thanks for joining us for a conversation about leadership.
Not the last conversation. This is the first conversation we're having about leadership in this season, but we're going to be talking about a lot of different leaders. Starting first at everyone's kind of entry level into leadership many times is if you're going in from that technician level, that first step is going to be into the lead tech role or the supervisor role. So yeah, this is going to be a great combo today.
Yeah, and if you were listening to our last episode, we gave a teaser at the very end about what was coming and talked about looking at this lead tech role or this, entry-level supervisor role, whether that's a supervisor or a lead tech, from a bunch of different angles. How, as a lead tech, do you succeed in the department? How do you have that difficult conversation with an employee? How, as a technician, do you respond to your lead techs? How, as a manager, do you train and do competencies for and support your lead techs and supervisors? So I know that we're going to be tempted to have this one run way long, but we're going to try our best not to try to wrap up everything there is to say about being a successful lead tech and everything there is to say about being a leader into this one conversation. But the reason that there is so much to say on this topic, Hank, I think is because this is that first introduction to leadership that a person has. I know in my personal experience and also in many lead techs and supervisors that I've promoted, that sterile processing supervisor role or sterile processing lead tech role is the first professional job that person has ever had where they have people reporting them to. And all of a sudden, the skill set has massively shifted from being an excellent technician to now they're being asked to be a supervisor or a lead tech. And there's a lot of preparing that can go in to help that transition go smoothly. But I've also seen it go not so smoothly where we just shift really hard from taking the high performing technician and assume they're going to be a high performing supervisor no matter what, just because they were good at being a tech. And that's not exactly the case. The skill sets are totally different. So I thought maybe we would start by having you highlight for us maybe what are some of those shifts that happen from stepping from a technician role into a leadership role, kind of at that first level of leadership in the lead tech or supervisor role, and what's different and distinct about that.
Yeah, maybe the best way, Bobby, to address that is to compare that job description conversation that we had last episode around technicians. What's your scope? What's your role? And then compare it to what that job description can be. And this is going to be one of the more fluid job descriptions. Lead techs and supervisors take many different forms and responsibilities depending on the department size that you're in. The other leadership structure, do you have a manager? Do you not have a manager? Do you have multiple locations of reprocessing in your facility? So is there like ancillary places that you're in charge of as a lead tech or the supervisor? So knowing all that, if there's complexity in play, it is definitely different from a technician. And so what's the lead about the lead tech? It ultimately goes down to getting above your assignment. If you're assigned, let's say, to decontamination as a technician, primarily, your responsibility is to get things out of decontam. As we've talked about in previous interviews, though, like we don't ever want you to just be so down into the weeds that you have no thoughts about anything else that's going on in the process, because we are a team, but it's not your responsibility necessarily to know the process is working the way it should. That's not true for the lead tech. That responsibility is on the shoulders and in the job description for lead techs and supervisors, to the point that they're in charge on their shift of ensuring that the day-to-day workflow of sterile processing is operating according to plan. This involves, things like, hey, who showed up? Did everyone show up that was on the schedule? If not, what do we do? How do we align and differentiate now with the assignment areas? Or maybe the schedule was made according to one surgery schedule, but now the surgeries have completely shifted. Maybe one doctor got sick, rescheduled. Maybe one doc is adding another 5 cases of revisions. And now someone in the department has to make a decision. What do we do next? And how do we support this? And typically that someone is at this lead tech and supervisory role. So, Bobby, going back to your question, what's different, or what's the opportunity here? Like, what's the challenge around these kinds of things? I think that gap many times of coming from a technician to a lead tech is that skill set of being able to read the department workflow, all the variables that are happening around you, including the people variables, the equipment variables, the inventory variables, the customer request variables that are coming from the OR, and then having the skill set and the intelligence, not like smart intelligence, but the leadership intelligence, the LI, to be able to then deploy that right decision and say, okay, if this is happening X, Y, and Z, then this needs to happen A, B, and C.
So maybe the technician in your department that you would consider to be the most aloof, probably not the best candidate for for running lead tech. And that very well may be your highest performer in terms of production and prep and pack, but they may not be as skilled at connecting the dots between the workflow implications of backups in different areas or fielding those really difficult phone calls. So I think that's helpful. You really dug into the discretion, the critical thinking piece of it. But another aspect that I think is really important, once you step from the technician level into that first level of leadership that becomes much more important, is a skill set of communication, of being able not only to communicate workflow needs, what priorities we have coming from the day, but also having conversations with technicians that might be a bit uncomfortable uncomfortable for you. And that might even be praise. Some people just really find it uncomfortable to enter a conversation where you don't know which way this thing is going to go and how somebody's going to respond, even if you're giving them some good feedback, but particularly if you're trying to correct some behaviors, whether that's, long lunches or you have to bear the bad news of that tray that had an error in it. And I know that very fear of having to be a communicator has kept some really excellent, hardworking technicians from applying for leadership roles for 30 years. They say that amount of money is not worth it to me to have those kinds of conversations. And so building that communication and working to elevate that critical thinking are two things that you're going to have to think about and work on if you want to step into that first role of leadership and succeed. Before I dig into that and ask you some more questions about how to prepare, I want to try to separate out these two terms of lead tech and supervisor that we've been using, because as I'm thinking about our listeners, every department is different. Some departments might not even have one. Some are going to have a lead tech. Others might have both. Some might only have a supervisor. So when we use those terms, at least in my mind, kind of the difference that you would see between a lead tech and a supervisor has to do with their scope of responsibilities. Typically, that lead tech is what Hank's describing of being a technician who's hands-on, does maybe 80% of their work with the other technicians, but they also have some additional duties on top of that have workflow implications. They're the ones maybe that are answering the phone or dealing with the difficult requests from the OR. They're the ones who might be making your assignments for who works in what areas for the day and shifting another body into decontamination if they're getting backed up, working on those kind of day-to-day workflow issues. A supervisor does all of those same things in many departments, but they might have some managerial tasks associated with it. They might be the ones making the schedule, checking time cards, in some cases even doing performance evaluations and discipline, kind of those more HR type roles. And so depending on how many technicians you have, whether or not you have a manager, how much support is needed in your department, you might have one of these, you might have the other. Some departments have both of them. The supervisor is all about, schedules and document keeping and performance tracking, and they don't do that much with the workflow, and the lead techs take care of that. So a lot of different models out there.
Yeah, Bob, I think that dynamic or the distinction that you mentioned is important when you go back to skill sets, because on the HR side of things, that is a skill set. How do you build a schedule? And how do you build a schedule that's not going to take advantage of people? It's going to be fair. Everyone's favorite F word. Is it fair? If there are questions or concerns or conflicts around the schedule, that's a skill set that the average lead tech, if that's not in your scope of responsibility, you may not even need that skill set. May not even have to worry about that skill set because that's the manager or that's the supervisor who has to take care of that. So, keeping these very distinct and then applying them to your own department situation wherever you are, as you go back into work, tomorrow morning and say, okay, what is my lead tech doing? If I have a supervisor, what are they doing that's different? And now you've kind of got some categories to better understand if you're looking at yourself as a potential growth opportunity into those roles, then where are those skill sets that you want to be cultivating?
Yeah. Now, Hank, I know as a technician, you were probably given the mic a handful of times or the baton, I guess is a better illustration, to watch the department and be kind of stand-in lead for the day, or maybe that first supervisor role that you had. So thinking about our lead techs and supervisors who might be listening and are new to their role, what are some of the potential pitfalls that they might run into early on as a lead tech or a supervisor?
It's scary, man. It's scary the first time. As a technician, you can keep your head down and just do your job and do it well. And you got your eyes on the team, you make sure the workflow, but everyone's working together to accomplish the goal. And you're not really an individual in that scenario. At the lead tech level, at the supervisor level, you're the person on that shift. You are an individual. Now you're still part of the team, but all eyes, all ears, or all questions, all issues. If, something goes wrong, they're not going and running to Johnny, the technician who's in decontam. They're running to Hank, the lead tech, and saying, Hank, we've got a problem and you're the person who has responsibility and the authority to fix it. And, for that first opportunity in that, if you've never been exposed to that in your career in the past, or even if you have, these stakes are pretty high. Like we're talking about surgery, we're talking about patients could be on the table and there's a problem that needs to be solved. Tens and thousands of dollars at stake if we have to cancel cases and like if we cook instruments that shouldn't be run through a steam autoclave, right? Like there's all kinds of things come down to you as the individual. So I think, the biggest challenge is just being aware of that dynamic, while also, and I want to call this out on the front end of this episode, on the technician episode we did last time, we saved the best for last, right? We talked about all the challenges and how hard it was. And at the very end, we were like, yeah, but this is still freaking awesome. So for the lead tech role, I want to kind of front end this and say, it is scary, but it is a terrific opportunity, especially for technicians who get frustrated because they feel like there's gaps and there's opportunities that we're missing. There's things we could do more efficiently. There's people that we could encourage better. Like all those things that you just kind of get built up inside you. You're like, I can do this well, or maybe even better than the previous person. And now you get the opportunity to really try it. That is an exciting place to be for new young leaders trying to test themselves and learn. It's a great place to learn because many times, like we talked about the career ladder, even though you're the person, you're the individual, there's typically someone in the department that's still above you as a lead tech. There's usually a manager somewhere that you can find, or even if there's not a sterile processing manager, you've always got the OR manager that you can go to. So there's someone else beyond you, even though you don't necessarily want to include them in every decision you make, right? Because that's your job to make decisions. But the buck doesn't stop with you. It kind of pauses with you. So it's a good, safe space to learn those skills in a lower stakes place, still with support, but still with real potential to make a positive impact on your team.
Yeah. And I think that's why you'll find in a lot of the manager job descriptions out there a requirement for, 3 to 5 years of prior supervisory experience. It feels a bit like gatekeeping, right? Keeping somebody out of that manager level job description. But really what that's there for is to ensure that you've had some time in the sandbox and learned some of those skill sets. In my experience, new supervisors in their first role, it's difficult to strike that balance between being really involved in trying to make everything right or kind of fleeing from conflict and hoping that it goes away, right? I was more of the latter. I was uncomfortable having some of those conversations and let some things go for far too long, just hoping that one day they would go away. And that creates a whole bunch of problems. But so does the opposite of just blasting people and not really working on those soft skills. And it's hard to get the slider in the middle of that spectrum when you're just getting started. But I appreciate what you said about the beauty of that role. It does give you some opportunity to work on some of those soft skills. But in my experience, what matters more than whatever technique that you use for having coaching conversations, whether you're for or against the sandwich model of communication, or say something good, then tell them what you really wanted to say, and then say something good. Regardless of what your strategy is, people want to know that your heart's in the right place. And so if you are a technician who cares about the patient, who has for a long time been building trust in your teammates, that you're trying to be fair primarily to the patient and doing what's right and trying to be a reasonable, likable person, you can get past some of those early mistakes and still succeed in the department if you're humble enough to call them mistakes and not have a big head about you. And so, yeah, I think it is a beautiful role to get started into leadership in. As I think about our lead tech, so we talked about, what's the positive of being one, what's the potential challenges that you run into. I want to talk to our leaders for a bit, our managers, and how do you pick out a lead tech? And once you have one, how do you support them and help them get through those kind of early bumps and bruises along the way?
Oh, Bobby, yeah, that one question could be an entire season by itself. We could definitely do 8 episodes around just navigating this frontline leadership, because that's what it is. It's really frontline leadership. It's that first level, closest to the workflow, closest to the people, closest to the problem. And that is a double-edged sword in that if you've got a great lead tech, you're going to have a great shift and there's going to be great improvements. If you have a problematic lead tech, the opposite is true. You're going to be eroding trust. You're going to be creating conflict. You're going to be missing and messing up the workflow. And so from that leadership perspective, I would go 2 angles with it. Like you asked, how do you pick the right one? I'm going to start maybe with the other one. Is a lot of times leaders inherit someone else's lead techs or someone else's supervisors. And you kind of come in and you're like, I don't know if I would have picked this person to do this role. And, for credit to the leaders that leave, just like we talked about in episode 1, lead techs and supervisors change over time, or they should change over time. Hopefully they're getting better and better at their roles. They're learning people more. And, how to have those hard conversations that you alluded to. They're learning how to manage workflows more. And they're realizing, next time that happens, I need to do this instead of this. And now I learned my lesson. And over time, they're getting better and better and better at their jobs. That's best case scenario. However, we've all seen scenarios, and you may be in a department right now, if you're tuning in, that for whatever reason, the lead tech is in charge does not have the trust or the respect of the team that they're leading, the shift that they're leading, or they don't have the trust or respect of the manager or the leader that they're reporting to. And either one of those scenarios is a really bad combination. So if you're a leader and you got a lead tech that's not meeting expectations, the most important thing, we'll talk about this a lot more on the manager episode, but the most important thing goes back to what you already said, Bobby, is communication. You've got to be transparent with this lead tech, honest, sensitive to maybe their lack of training or their lack of support in the past, but you got to be honest with them about the critical impact that their actions and their words are having every single day on the ship that they're leading, and the critical nature that you cannot lead a department well if your frontline leaders have gaps in these areas that we've kind of been laying out. All right. All that being said, how do you pick the good ones? I think the biggest challenge that you've kind of laid out is you don't pick the good ones by finding just the best tech. Who's the most productive? Who always shows up? Who does everyone love? That's going to be our new lead tech. Or, who's been there the longest? I know that's kind of a slight to the union environment a little bit, but let's just be real, guys. Just because you've been there the longest, it doesn't mean that you meet all of these skill sets and all these attributes that we've been laying out that makes a good quality lead tech. So if that's not what you do, you don't just hire the best tech. You don't just hire the one that's been there the longest. What you do need to do is hire someone that has demonstrated that skill set of rising above their assignment area and being able to make decisions at the workflow level that positively impacts what's going on. That's really hard to do if that's not your role. You get slapped down as a technician if you're trying to do things that the lead tech does or that the supervisor does. It's kind of like the kids that come from like a broken home and you're like, you're not my real dad, right? Like, you're not going to tell me what to do. Well, same thing if you're a technician trying to tell someone else what to do. You're like, you're not the supervisor. Why are you trying to tell me to go to this different assignment area to prioritize this tray? Well, at that lead tech, in prepping for trying to identify that candidate to be a good lead tech, you've got to find a way to give your technicians opportunity in safe spaces to make some of these workflow decisions in order for you as a leader to say, Susan is really good. She understands when it gets crazy in the OR, what we need to do to navigate to make sure that all these instruments still get out on time and at a quality standard. And the other piece of the puzzle that you've kind of brought out too, Bobby, is does this person demonstrate an ability to have conversations politely, but directly. And if they have those two, I think you've got a great candidate on your hands.
What's really powerful about what you said and picking for lead techs, you need to have a plan in place before the time comes to replace that lead tech, right? And so having a sandbox for technicians to practice some of those skills in a safe environment is a much better plan than waiting until your supervisors got COVID and just sticking somebody in there and hoping that they figure it out for the next 2 solid weeks. So yeah, being intentional to have that is really helpful. And I also, in a very similar way, wanted to highlight what you said about, as a leader, communicating to try to help struggling supervisors or lead techs succeed. We say all the time in sterile processing that a solid training program and solid competencies are really important for our technicians, and that there's a big gap in the industry for not having good enough training programs and competencies. I'd say that gap is even bigger when it comes to supervisors. The general model for sterile processing supervisors is promote them with very little training and tell them kind of the goal of what you want to happen for the shift. Like, we want people to trust you, be fair with people, keep up with their time cards and their schedules, and make it happen. And we send them off without any kind of competency or training regarding soft skills, or even a standard procedure of what a supervisor does, because 2 supervisors with the same job description, same kind of department are going to go about it in totally different ways. And so I think it can be really valuable to take that supervisor job description and build out some competencies, some training, and some SOPs related to supervision. If it says in there that they're to oversee the decontamination, prep and pack, sterilization, and distribution of sterile supplies in your department, there ought to be a supervisor audit sheet where once a week they go into decontam for 15 minutes and they watch a few trays go through the process and check off that it's happening according to procedure, give some good feedback to those technicians, and turn it into the manager. It feels like micromanagement, but what it is you're giving them a pathway to succeed at their job description and to start making it a more normal part of the department for them to be able to supervise and it not feel weird to the technicians. Those types of things that we can do to help our frontline leaders in probably their first ever job in leading employees can be really powerful in shaping so that whenever it comes time to replace that manager, you've got somebody who has some practiced skills under their belt and has earned that trust. So I don't know if you've ever seen that implemented well in a department. Even in the departments that I led, I don't think I implemented that well, but I think that's the vision we ought to be working towards. What do you think?
Yeah, the one thing that that came to mind as I was hearing you speak, that's also a leadership gap, or maybe an expectation gap around competencies and SOPs, but just kind of department policy. And I have seen a tremendous amount of success/challenge is, what relationship do your lead techs have to each other from shift to shift? Do they talk? Do they collaborate? Are they on the same page? Are they operating complete independence in a vacuum from one another? No idea what the other one's telling their shift, or doing with their shift, or struggling with their shift, and everyone on each shift is reinventing the wheel. That is not a good dynamic or scenario for excellence in sterile processing. So I just want to call that out, to anyone who is in that situation right now. If you are a lead tech, if you're a technician on a dysfunctional shift in a dysfunctional department, maybe one of the questions that your lead techs or your manager needs to be asking is, hey, are we doing anything on a regular basis to bring these lead techs together on the same page and coordinate some standard operating procedures from shift to shift in just how the leaders lead? I get it. Every leader is going to have a different skill set, but if you come in to your first shift and it's such a different dynamic in terms of leadership style than it is for your night shift, you got a problem. It shouldn't be good cop, bad cop, and I want to go to second shift because that's the good cop that works. That's not what we're looking for. That's not what we want to create. We want them all to be good cops and to be on the same page and be driving excellence where everyone wants to work on every shift because they know that the leaders have that standard approach. But to your point, Bobby, if we don't have competencies, we don't have any SOPs for the leaders, you're not going to get there because you're not going to be able to hire the same person. You have to train them into those models and into those routes. I think that's a very important call out.
And that's actually a good segue into what I want to wrap with, because we're quickly running out of time and we've left so much on the table as it is already. But as we look at leadership, we've talked about how to succeed as a leader. We've talked about managers helping that lead tech. But I want to look at this frontline leader through the eyes of a technician, whether you have a good frontline leader or a bad one. What are some of the unique things that a frontline technician can do to help make sure that their shift succeeds and their frontline leader directly reporting to succeeds?
So, Bobby, in episode 1, we talked about the overwhelming kind of flood of information that comes to new technicians. Well, a similar but smaller flood happens when you move from technician to lead tech, because you go from just one of the team, you're in the breaking room, and like you're talking about, I can't believe the lead tech did this, can't believe supervisor did this. So like you go from that to, oh, you're the one that everyone's in the break room now talking about. I can't believe they did X, Y, and Z. And that's a really hard transition, no matter who you are and no matter how, confident you are and everything else. So I would encourage technicians to be kind to your lead techs and understand that they're having to make decisions. They've got responsibility on their shoulders. It's bigger than just them. It's a responsibility now for the entire shift and for the workflow and the output. And they've got people behind them, either the supervisor, the manager, the director, the surgeons now that are looking to them, expecting results. And they can't, as individuals, control all the results, because the people on the front line are the technicians and they're the ones making the results. And so you got someone sandwiched in between with more mental stress than they've ever had, potentially in their entire life in their career. And now they're managing this scenario. Even if they've been doing the job, for years and years, they're still walking around with that stress. So it's a weird encouragement, but number one, I would say be kind, Bobby. Number two, as a technician, even if your leader is not the kind of leader that you would say is a good leader, it's not someone that you want to emulate. If you ever became a lead tech, you can still and should still be doing everything that you can do to raise your ability as a technician to excel in your role, in your assignment areas. And tied to that is this succession planning that you kind of referenced. If you want to grow as a technician, either in your role or your title or just your scope of knowledge, I would constantly be peppering my lead tech and saying, hey, is there anything I can do today or this week or next week that's extra? It's an addition. Do you need an area to be cleaned or straightened up? Can I go through the backup wall if we get slow tonight, to be doing it? Like constantly be asking those things of your lead tech. Number one, you're going to be putting it on their radar if they didn't notice the backup wall was dirty, but now they know. Number two, you're going to be getting that higher level perspective that's going to be equipping you potentially when this job opportunity comes available at the lead tech supervisor level. You're going to be able to plop down your resume and be like, I've done this. I've cleaned up the backup wall. I was a part of this project. I led this initiative as a technician, only because you're seeking to help your lead tech do well, if you like them or if you don't.
Yeah, that's really wise. And I think we've all been in that situation where you have to be in a spot to respect a leader that doesn't feel so respectable, but being committed to do the right thing for the patient is always the right answer. So I appreciate that encouragement, Hank. And I think that's going to do it for today's interview. Last week, we ended our conversation by talking about the beauty of being a sterile processing technician, being the ones who touch those instruments, and the next time they will touch human skin is in the OR. Well, at Beyond Clean, we love our frontline leaders. They are our cultural champions. As you alluded earlier, Hank, this is the person on whom the department's culture is either going to flounder or succeed. And so we encourage you to stick to it. And if you're a technician with some aspirations to grow, this is a great way to get started asking that question of what more can I do? And really being eager to get that first chance at leading a department well and really elevating that culture. So Hank, thanks for joining me on this criminally short conversation of an introduction to leadership in the sterile processing department.
It's a pleasure to be here, Bobby. Thanks.
And that's going to do it for this week's show on lead techs and supervisors. Looking forward to what we've got coming up next week. We're going to be looking at the role of educators, our favorite people who toe that line between being the confident authority of what's right in the department, but also the curious learners who are always reading the new standards. So, Hank, you ready to talk about some educators next week?
Yeah, Bobby, I'm not going to pick favorites in this season, but, for as much as we talk about education and as we promote that in the industry, there's definitely a special place in all of our hearts at Beyond Clean for educators. And I know anyone who's been lucky enough to have an educator in your department or be an educator or want to get an educator, you already see the value of this conversation. But yeah, we're going to dive into all things sterile processing educators in this next episode. Can't wait to get there, Bob.
Yeah, we are primed and ready, so we're looking forward to having you join us next week. That's going to do it for today's show. So until we see you next time, we encourage you, as we always do here at Beyond Clean, keep fighting dirty.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on your favorite podcast app, or by downloading the smartphone app on iPhone or Android. Simply search for Beyond Clean in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@beyondclean.net. We look forward to hearing from you.